Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture. Our invited speakers are the editors of a very important recently published book on the urban design legacy of Colin Rowe. So I'll hold it up for you to see. Magnificent volume. It is an amazing collection of essays by scholars and architects who, as students and collaborators of Rowe, played a critical role in the critique of modernist attitudes toward our city and the degradation that these attitudes wrought in the built environment. The book is beautifully produced, and I urge you all to admire your own copy. As most of you know, Colin Rowe was one of the most influential architectural and urban design critics of the 20th century. For nearly 3 decades, he was professor of architecture at Cornell University's Urban Design Studio. Tonight's presentation will outline his influence on the discipline of urban design, the principles that animate the writing and build work of his followers, the influence of his teaching methods, and the profound effect he had on the architectural profession. A renewed interest in traditional architecture and urbanism that we promote here at Notre Dame owes much to Colin Rowe. Our indebtedness, however, amounts to more than mere intellectual reverberations. A number of our own faculty over the past 40 years studied at Cornell and are deeply affected by his teachings on the poetics of form and the making of cities. Among those folks, I list my former dean, Michael Blackudis, Professors Colin Rowe, Stephen Hurtt, James Tice, Michael Dennis, Paul Count, and myself. It's hard to understate the extent of our indebtedness to Colin Rowe's teaching and legacy. So it's an immense pleasure for me to introduce to you our 2 speakers tonight, who are the co-editors of this magnificent new book. Stephen Hurtt is professor and former dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Maryland. As dean, he led the school's transformation to include master's degree programs in community planning and historic preservation. He also founded the National Center for Smart Growth and initiated the master's program in real estate and the PhD program in urban and regional planning and design. He has been instrumental in developing the University of Maryland campus master plan and numerous projects of national significance. In 1994, he helped to organize and jury the university competition for the Maryland Center for the Performing Arts. He was a jury member of the Williamsburg Town Competition and the Glenwood Town Hall Competition in Illinois. Professor Hurtt teaches design studio and is the author of important essays on the work of Le Corbusier and urban design issues. He holds degrees from Cornell and Princeton universities and is a charter member and former board member of the CNU. In the late 1960s, he was a student of Colin Rowe's graduate urban design studio at Cornell. And from 1973 to 1990, he taught at the University of Notre Dame. James Tice is an architect, urban designer, artist, and professor emeritus at the University of Oregon, where he teaches design studio theory and watercolors. He studied with Colin Rowe at Cornell University, graduating with an MArch in urban design in 1970. He has co-authored the book Courtyard Housing in Los Angeles, together with our dean, Stefanos Piedaitis, and other important studies, including Frank Lloyd Wright, Between Principle and Form, Architectural Principles, the Interregnum of Noli Me Wedesite, Giuseppe Vazzi's Rome, and numerous essays on architecture, education, and urban design. In 2014, he received the University of Oregon's Outstanding Research Career Award. We look forward very much to tonight's lecture. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our 2 speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Well, let me say how much of a pleasure it is for me to be here. Thank you Thank you for inviting me. I feel like I'm coming home in a way. I feel like I am part of I dare to call it an extended family. I see many friends here, but also friends on the walls in your new building, splendid new building, which is the first time I've had the pleasure of seeing. I do want to make clear that standing here, I have 24 people, actually 23 people behind me, and one person in front of me. There are 25 of us engaged in this book. So it's not Kid Tice's book by any stretch of the imagination. It really was a collective effort. And I'm thinking what Oscar Wilde would say about the role of an editor. So I'll say it for myself, and I won't hold Steve responsible. Oscar Wilde said, the editor is someone who spends the morning deciding where to put a comma and then spends the afternoon taking it out. So that is something in a nutshell about what our process has been, which is maybe one reason why it's taken 10 years in fruition. So what I'd like to do in my half of the presentation is say something briefly about the book itself, something about Colin Rowe, his principles, teaching. Then I'm going to zoom in on something that's close to my heart, and I think close to Colin's heart, and that is the city of Rome as a paradigm of urban design, and perhaps much else. Winding up with some notes about two important projects, which I think represent the Colin Rowe's approach to urban design. Besides the political, social, and economic strains in our towns and cities, their duty, their capacity to embody our highest aspirations to satisfy a very human longing for a sense of place and identity are falling short. And in the words of Gertrude Stein, why should a citizen love and honor a city if there's nothing there? This book attempts, through Colin Rowe and his creative group, labeled by Antonio Latini, one of our early collaborators, to address this question. The organization of the book is something I'd like to just talk about briefly. It's divided into 5 sections, which you see here, which talk about Colin Rowe and urban design, basically a kind of compressed version of what one might find in his urban design studio. Then talking about pedagogy, about how he taught and how he thought, I think, about teaching, the section on Rome, and praxis, the results of his teaching, how it actually came to be, what was realized in his name, we might say. Then finally, a diagnosis, prognosis, looking at the future of the city, diagnosis of where we are now, and about what that possible future might be. This is a quick overview of Rowe's writings by and about Rowe during a fairly compressed period of time. It does begin in 1947 and ends with our book in 2025. But in between time, this set of images, which was collected by Blake Middleton, one of our authors, gives you some idea, a taste at least, of the scope of Rowe's influence. But Rowe was certainly a central figure in the debate about urban design during that period. As Richard mentioned, beginning teaching in 1962 at Cornell, winding up in 1990, until his death in 1999. So these two images from Rowe's writing, Collage City, of course, with Fred Coder, and his later book on architecture, but also touching on urban design, has two images which are really quite important, I think, if we think about Rowe as defining, giving some insight perhaps to Rowe himself. Well, the plan voiced by in the former image makes his point about the dialectical nature of urban design figured around the split-faced Medusa sun by Le Corbusier, makes a profound, if not more enigmatic, comment about the dialectical manner in which one might apprehend the world more broadly. And it is both of these images, which may in different ways put one in the proper frame of mind to fully appreciate, I think, Colin Rowe and what how he thought his very being, I think, essentially being a dialectical way of looking at not only architecture and urban design, but probably life and culture in more general terms. I like to think of these as being a kind of visage of Rowe. Rowe was surprisingly reticent about articulating his position on some of these subjects. They came in rather sometimes very obscure references that it was our job as his students to delve into and actually figure them out, sometimes looking at an arcane folio from the 18th century. But there was definitely a pedagogy involved here. And as typical with Rowe, he would often let his colleagues do the heavy lifting when it came to such things as coming up with lists, which he frankly abhorred. And Jerry Wells, one of his close associates at Cornell, came up with this succinct list of points. Jerry Wells did write an article in a piece in our book. So forgive me if I read them to you now. Design teaching is based on 5 fundamental ideas. The architectural space that many think are important aspects of architecture. And here we have to read architecture and urban design. That architecture is greater than a single part, that is not a stylized object on its own, but a product of its context and a contributor to that context. That architecture exists in history, and that the history and understanding of architecture and its analysis should therefore be taught as a discipline in conjunction with design, creating knowledge of precedents and real respect for architecture and culture and context for ideas. That how and why are still important questions, and that although we can teach architecture, that we cannot teach architecture, but we can teach students how to learn about architecture. So I think this is an important point about Colin, this image, which actually owes something to my teacher, Bernard Hosley, one of Colin's colleagues from his Texas days, where Bernard posited that our typical way of thinking about history, architectural history, about history in general, is it's a linear progressive view. So we can go from Pantheon to Falling Water and the Tokyo Forum with everything in between. And what Hosley did, which I thought was really brilliant, but I think captures exactly, in my view, what Rowe was interested in, is thinking about history as a constellation, and that your position in this constellation could change, and the elements in the constellation could change. And furthermore, during your lifespan, if not from morning coffee to evening drinks, might change again. So there's this dynamic relationship posited by Rowe about how we might connect the history, and that the idea of some kind of linear Hegelian zeitgeist-inspired unfolding of history was really anathema to Rowe. So I once asked Colin, what about our future? And it was a naive student, Colin, where do you go from here? What should we do? Colin said, the first thing we should do is do a demo job on modern architecture. That's an exact quote. And these images are meant to represent this kind of modern fantasy world in the first couple of decades of the 20th century with Le Corbusier's green, leafy city of towers. And in some ways, we might say the opposite in Frank Lloyd Wright. But both saw the city dissolving. Both saw the city dissolving into some kind of leafy ether. And by mid-century, and this is where Colin came in, I think, as a strong revulsion to what was happening by mid-century, where Frank Lloyd Wright work became defaced and demoralized, we might say, and the Tower in the Park became famous tower in the parking lot. From a European point of view, Gropius, Hilbersheimer were doing not exactly the same building form, but the same idea about erasing the city, building a brave new world. And of course, we all know about St. Louis and Yamasaki's Pruitt-Igoe, which 1972 met its demise, which we all know about. So it was Colin, and reacting to this, and I don't think it was purely reactive. It was much more inspired in a positive, forward-looking way. But Colin always referenced us to the existing city, to the traditional city. And it was that rediscovery of the city. This is something that Mike Dennis points out in his essay in the book, that rediscovery of the city, which I think was so important. So this is a quote attributed, admittedly, to Colin. I'm open to new things, but I'm not willing to give up the things I love just because they are old, like that 17th century French concoction, champagne, very typical Rowan common. And what about the traditional city, the city that was evaporating? Well, look at the streets, Colin would say. And we have three wonderful examples here of great streets. It's really always been interesting to me to see how people have picked up on that theme, oftentimes without attributing Colin. Not that Colin was the only one talking about streets, but many of the, I think, have somewhere in their DNA some idea about the streets promoted by Colin. I love this line that Colin says, architects suffer from stratophobia. And I've asked my students about, well, how can you exist in a city without streets? And I said, do you expect to meet your soulmate in a Costco parking lot, for goodness sakes? And I mean, the kind of interaction that streets provide, that is really terribly important. Colin was very clear about that. And these views, one from China, the CCTV building, which I think we've all seen. I'm comparing it next to something just up the street from me in Eugene, Oregon, in Cortland, this beautiful Pioneer Square. And I used to think, I didn't really believe Louis Kahn when he said it's possible to have a beautiful city with ugly buildings. I'm still not entirely sure about that. But Ortega Gasset, I think, hit the nail on the head when he said, imagine a city built by brilliant architects. Each of their buildings might be magnificent in and of itself, and yet the city as a whole would be bizarre and intolerable. We know these images, and I show them one especially on the left to remind us Colin's fascination with Gestalt psychology. This is from a Gombrich, a good friend of his from Warburg, where that was somehow a part of Colin's way of thinking. And we know the two images, you focus on the vase, you leave out the faces, and then you focus on the faces and you leave, so there's this counterchange, Gombrich calls it counterchange between the two, that makes a whole. So like Weisbach, it requires both of these ideas and awareness of that to make the city whole, we might say. Yeah. Lessons from Colin Rowe included Camilo Cite. Wasn't such a big fan of Gordon Cullen, but it is interesting that Cullen does show in Town State, does show figure ground drawings. And of course, Camilo Cite shows perspective. So this is meant to talk about the city as a conceptual, a way of conceptually representing the city, abstracting it, but also dealing with the perceptual aspect of the city. I think being both important for Colin, although honestly, he didn't really talk about the Colin end of things as much. And from Colin City, we know these brilliant dichotomies between the Uffizi and the Unitari, the Uffizi being enjoyable for the Marseille, being perfect representations of object fixation by modern architects on the one hand, and the ability in traditional cities to see the space as being the object, as being the protagonist. So this idea of space and anti-space, which Steve Peterson talks about as part of that, maybe best summed up by an idea of acropolitan space as opposed to pore-like space, which will kind of see collage city. And, one could spend an entire lecture talking about these two images, the hedgehog and the fox, and the idea of the unitary vision for planning, total design, as opposed to what one sees in Hadrian's Villa. So in Hadrian's Villa and Versailles is this, again, one of these important comparisons and antinomies. Someone once mentioned, I don't know if it was Tom Schumacher, I think it was he that said, oh yeah, Hadrian's Villa, it's really a miniature golf course, isn't it? So Rome. Why Rome for Colin? Well, I think Colin really believed that Rome was truly the cradle or crucible of Western civilization. But for Colin, who lived in Rome for a number of years off and on, as Richard pointed out, taught in the Notre Dame program, also the Cornell program in Rome, it was a bountiful set of lessons, that had to do with figured ground, object versus space, dialectical thinking about ideal and real, which we'll finally get into in a little bit. The city was a paradigm of the ways of thinking about the city. There's so many different ways of thinking about the city as a stratified city over many different epochs, growing up incrementally. So it was not about the total design. It was not about big ball erasing the city. It was definitely an incremental condition. The Noli map was a great way of representing that. How many do we see? Am I running over? Pardon me?
5-minute warning.
5-minute warning. Okay. So you all know the Noli, I'm sure. And the way the Noli map represents space so well. But let me jump to this. This is what I like to tell my students. This is the map from hell. And this is the map from hell. This is a little actually online, the right-hand side. So the simplicity of the Noli map, giving you a gestalt, giving you a quick, intuitive understanding of space in the city, is missing on the right-hand side. It's nowhere to be found. It's a way of graphically representing architectural and urban design ideas, which is very important for Colin. And if you look at the way the lattice Piazza Navona, but it neatly confines within the space of the Piazza Navona. If you look at what's happening to the Piazza Navona, unfortunately, it's just going to slam. In other words, no understanding or appreciation of the spatial nature of the city and how you might represent it effectively. The website that I've been involved with for the last 20 years, the Noli Map website, has the three-dimensional feature. And I show this as a way to maybe amplify a little bit what we think, what is represented in the Noli Map. And I think Colin was very aware of the hills in Rome and the 7 hills. If you want to impress your friends, the 7 hills of Rome you can remember with this mimetic from that any English school child would know, circa 1890. Can Queen Victoria eat cold apple pie? Victoria prefers jam. So Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, Chelian, Aventine, and Palatine are the 7 hills. If you notice, Rome is a great floodplain. I mean, there are hills, valleys. I'm not sure if you can read all of this, but there's especially these valleys that contain the Forum, the Roman Forum, and the Circus Maximus, leading toward the Campo Morzo, which is basically a floodplain. With that information and looking at flood waters historically, you can begin to see why building Rome where it was built was a bad idea, at least from an environmental point of view. So this is a flood pattern recorded in 1870. You might find the Pantheon of kind of swimming in the campus marshes there and really infiltrating other parts of the city as well. And this is what it was like working with the city in 1870. So you get some idea how it may have affected the buildings. The Roman Tarota, which was part of Colin's extension, his fascination with Rome, I think is well known to many of you here. And it's a scheme. We don't have really time to get into it now, but that drawing on the left-hand side by Peter Carley on the Palatine Hill established as a kind of fictive version of the Domus Ligustana. That's the main building here, creating axis, which becomes the cross-axis for the entire scheme, which you see here. The cross-axis is formed by the Circus Maximus. There are other major streets that frame the ensemble. And I think the geometrical scheme on the right-hand side is derived from something Graham Shane did and included in our essay. And I think that Shane hit on something very important about Rowe's attitude toward this abstract geometry that acted as a kind of scaffold for his work and his thinking. Of course, Colin's great insights allowed him to see how you could derive from that rather cold abstraction and how many different directions it could go. So I think, as Graham also points out, that there was an connection and continuity between some of Colin's earlier fascination with the grid and the mathematics of the ideal villa, maybe extending to the Roman Tarota, which was a kind of plausible, fictional take on what Rome could have been after 1870, which paired up with Jimmy Tamayo's, I think, brilliant essay on Roman Tarota from the fictive novel aspect that Colin wrote about it. So this is talking about transformation. You might see that it's all emanating from a certain square at the center. This is courtesy of Klaus Verdi and Mike Dennis from Cornell, showing how the fixed, simple geometric shape in this time, so we're talking about form, typomorphology by way of Kenichi and Muratori. For those of you who are interested in this aspect of typology, very important situation from which Colin, I think by extension, although we never really talked that much about typology, to be sure, but the idea of the palazzo type, right, the square donut, being malleable, changeable according to circumstance, so that the context of the city acted on this simple geometric shape. And this is an illustration, this dialectic between the real and the ideal, about how context could influence buildings and make them into something more sensitive to the context and to the surrounding context of the scale of the city and also the local scale. So these are diagrams, one done by my student who looked at the transformation between the two buildings. This is an extension of this study on typology that Stefanos knows all about. And we did courtyard housing in Los Angeles back in the 70s. It was that idea of types that I think was very important. I like to think about the study of courtyard housing in Los Angeles as a kind of transformation of thinking about the palazzo moving to Los Angeles, no matter how improbable that would be. in a sense that you have an ideal state, and then it becomes the form according to the context, not only physical and spatial context, but a cultural context as well. My studies in Rome involve micro-urbanism, and I'm running out of time, so let me just say that these four examples of Santa Maria della Pace, Piazza San Ignazio, Porta di Ripetta, and Scalinata di Spagna were studies on my part, but inspired by Colin. In fact, Colin sent me to Rome and he said, Jim, you should look at these four sites. And of course, I said, "Aye, aye, sir," and went off to Rome in 1972 and started to do just that. So I show these examples of Santa Maria della Pace because I think it's very important. On the left-hand side, you have Molinari's beautiful black and white photograph shown as an object. I mean, for goodness sake, Santa Maria della Pace is not about the church. Yes, it is about the church, but not only the church, it's about the piazza. And it's Vazzi, the 18th century Venetista, who could capture that. And so the idea that I don't want to trample on anyone's foot, but art historians, bless their heart, and architectural historians, at least the kind that I had at Cornell, not Colin, but others, tended to look at buildings as isolated objects. And the photograph, the means by which to talk about these buildings, I think, help give the wrong impression about buildings and what their role is in the city. I mean, I don't know how you folks may have been, but when I first went to Rome and I saw something like Santa Maria della Pace, or San Agnese, I mean, for goodness sakes, even the Pantheon, I said, what will these other buildings do here? They aren't supposed to be here. It's like, wow. So a set of diagrams associated with Santa Maria della Pace. And I must say that one of my pleasures as a teacher was able to counsel and coach students who visited the city. The diagram at the top is an unfolding of Santa Maria della Pace. The sequence below is showing the kind of animation transformation of Santa Maria della Pace from Bramante Tempietto to something far more complex embedded in the city fabric. The same thing with San Ignazio, where the piazza and the church are linked together, again with another transformation kind of animation looking at that. This is Porta di Ripetta, one of my favorite places in the city conceptually because it no longer exists. Occurring as a kid in the curvature of the river, placed it in a special position, and for me, if I were to choose one drawing from the early 18th century that I think is really amazing, is this one by Specchi, who shows his design. He shows, if you look carefully at what was happening before his design, and then on the right-hand side, he's looking in the other direction toward the river and also across the Prati to St. Peter's. And then he shows his diagram front and center, which I think is really important fix on the church. I always forget, I think it's San Rocco. A more complex example is the Scalinata di Spagna, which I'm showing here, that is influenced by the hill, the Solonstian gardens to the north, and the hill leading to the Villa Medici and so forth. It's a complex urban setting. The first two examples are rather centrifugal, but Scala di Spagna and the Porta di Ripetta reach out, in this centrifugal way. So there's an interesting comparison between those pairs. This is showing them. I also do watercolors, and I encourage my students to do watercolors. So this is part of a conceptual understanding of the city, but also looking at the city. I think about the sparkle of midday fountain in the broken fountain at the foot of Spanish Steps, or kind of melancholy late afternoon view of the Spanish Steps, or kind of full of people, as being something kind of capture the spirit of place. I also appreciate, and I'm seeing some really wonderful diagrams by your students who look at these these same buildings more analytically, with beautiful sections, setting proportions, and so on, I think is also very important. So Seaside, for me, both Seaside and the World Trade Center, I think, are two important the capstones to Rowe's way of thinking about urban design, a way of thinking about making public space, about allowing the settlements to occur and coalesce around civic space, encouraging a democratic interchange amongst the people. And this diagram, I believe by Neil Payton, who wrote an essay in our book, shows Seaside on one side and what the developer's version of it would have been on the right-hand side. And to me, that tells us an important cautionary tale about that world of kind of laissez-faire urbanism, if we can even call it that, urbanism, that laissez-faire attitude as opposed to a structured, responsible way of thinking about the environment. And I think one of the tragedies, and I think Steve and I both agree on this, Steve Hurtt, that Steve Peterson and Barbara Littenberg's essay in the World Trade Center, knitting together, healing, quite literally healing the fabric of the city after the World Trade Center was blown up, demolished, is really it's a tragedy that this was not realized. And the image on the right-hand side shows that both Peterson and Littenberg were thinking about tying that part of the city to the south, to Battery Park, with an avenue in between, those kind of linkages to the city, looking at the city even in more detail in the heart of it, where the gardens, the memorial gardens would coalesce around public meeting spaces and so forth. All of that can be compared with Daniel Easton's project on the right-hand side. So the idea of streets, of spaces, parks, gardens infiltrating the city, green, knit in with the built fabric, all of that is really missing on the right-hand side in any kind of coherent way. And that's why I think that the World Trade Center, it is an important antidote. It would have been a splendid urban piece that I think we all would actually, people, ordinary folks, would love to go to New York to be able to memorialize that quiet, defined space. So here's Colin Rowe again with the visage of the Medusa head. He looks rather tormented. Doesn't he? He's not tormented about this talk I'm giving. Where Colin says, between belief and doubt, it's better to believe. And I think there's always an optimistic side of Colin. He certainly was aware of the travails that we're faced with as urban designers, as architects. But I do think that there was also a spirit of, eventually common sense may prevail. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
So more or less to begin again, if you will. About editing, I must say, I was a while, must have been really irritated by editors to say such a thing. I mean, what a put down. I have an entirely new respect for editors who often are confronted by contributors or people who fantasize about making books, and have a really tough time taking general advice, like, you really got 2 essays here, and maybe we could make 2 essays out of it instead of 1, and things like that, which happened a couple of times. I mean, it was just a phenomenal experience to be involved. And similarly, somebody might put down comments about imagery. And let me just say that an awful lot of the images that we got from people were perfect the way they were. But others benefited enormously from the effort that Tice put into making them read better. Ultimately, automated and over the book. It's just, it was a real challenge to do this. We're very, very proud of the product. I hope you all dive in. And when you do, we would appreciate hearing from you any thoughts or ideas you have about it. That would probably be my conclusion. So let's go here. I'm going to really talk about a couple of things. One of them is represented here. It's a project that I cooked up when I taught freshman year. And this project, so I taught here from 73 to 90. And took over the curriculum courses, which were two lecture courses, one in the fall, one in the spring, and kind of read vetted those courses. And if you take the idea that tables might represent a city, that helps you think about architecture in more complex terms. That's one of the things I'll talk about, that project. The other thing that I'll talk about in terms of Colin's impact has to do with the phenomenal expansion of this campus. On the left-hand side is an image from a work that was done by my other faculty member here, Tom Schler, who developed in the, I think, early 1970s, it was when I was here, a guide to the campus as it was then. And the drawing on the left-hand side does a pretty terrific job of representing the campus at that time as part of that guide. The drawing was actually made by either a fourth or the fifth year architecture student, Rick Stensel. What's so notable here and important to the thing that I'll talk about is the extent to which on the left-hand side of the campus, the main quad, the south quad, and the north quad are all very, very defined quadrangular spaces made by buildings, and that there's a hierarchy of the buildings, and that the whole thing stopped down where the Morris Inn is, and the stadium, and then there's that kind of cleavage between that edge and what happens at the stadium, the library, two high-rise dormitories, Flower and Grace, and what was then Stephen Hall. And what do we have? We have, in a sense, the traditional city on the left and the modern city on the right. And that was actually highly advantageous in terms of teaching these fundamental lessons, at that time, in terms of that dichotomous and a formal condition, and also intellectually dichotomous tradition in terms of sort of Jane Slow-side versus zeitgeist attitudes and approaches. I'll talk briefly about this other experience I had. After about 6 years I was here, I had to go to Rome and spend a year in Rome, and I was studying field study courses. And I tried this project, which I'll get into when I get there and talk just a little bit about it. Part of the point being how much we as teachers often learn from our students, including the sort of mistakes or errors or what we regard as the lack of commitment on the first part. Students, so sometimes is the case and sometimes not, as I've learned. So as I dive into these things, I feel like I have to place myself for you both chronologically and intellectually. And this, which was one of the things that I found that Jim and I developed along the way at some point, pretty well describes it. That I'm coming out of the program, I'm in the program in 66, 67 at Cornell. The drawing on the bottom left, which is the buffalo waterfront,
project had just been completed at that point. We were all very, very excited about this project because of the fact that it seemed to be challenging the attitude about modern architecture, that it was expanding on and extending the existing formal order of the city. And in 1966, what a revolutionary idea that was. And we were conscious of the fact in the studio that Colin was very reluctant about quote unquote movements in architecture, but we thought this was important, that we were a foundation stone for a new movement. What we needed was a name for it, and we ought to get it out there and push it. And we started talking about contextualism, and that term still floats around out there. Soon after, two of those students, Tom Schumacher at the top, Tom Schumacher in 1971, wrote that essay, Contextualism, Urban Ideals, Deprivation. Stuart Colin wrote Physical Context, Corporate Context, including it all. Stuart and I did a joint thesis together. We were talking about that stuff every day during the time that we were working on our thesis. 1971, 1974, I showed up teaching here in 1973, right at that moment in time. Soon took over the project courses and began doing the project, and I'll show you just a year or two later. In that next time frame, 1975 through 1987, basically a whole bunch of people are writing essays having to do this, getting this idea out. Another way of illustrating this, as Jim has shown with relative to our Guild. It's in the same time frame, of course, that Roman Coder at the bottom here, they actually write code. See, it's done according to Rome in 1973, but it's probably until 1978. The important point here is we students might have been calling it contextualism, but when Roman Coder wrote the book, they sort of took this idea and connected it more specifically to the psychological world and made this reference to something we call cultural field, which, if you will, is a more expansive notion of the fundamental ideas. So here I am at Notre Dame, trying to figure out how to carry this idea into the school, saying to myself, if Rowe says the applicability is the problem because it destroys the city, and as Jim said, the architectural historians are basically teaching history on the basis of object buildings. And that's what we're getting in architecture studios lots of times. What might be a better way to strike a better balance between the individual building and its role relative to the city? And then somehow or other, a kind of reorientation of the idea of who it is St. Barbara is pointing. What ideas St. Barbara, patron saint of architecture, pointing to rather than primitive hut. On the one hand, the attention, as really the students embraced big time, has to do with classical architecture and how it might be reasonably deployed. Part of our problem in 1960 was that the primitive hut is also being represented by this stuff, which is pretty antagonistic to the city in terms of what it might be done. How might we actually take that idea and get students to begin to think of it more holistically in terms of the city? And that's when I created this project and understand that it was based on a series of lectures that I was giving, figured around based on Gestalt psychology, similar notions by Rudolf Arnheim in terms of energy fields. The whole idea of spatial envelope, which was really easy to get students to think about in terms of all the sticks they stick on their dormitory walls and going to places where, there's a lot of loud music so that you're allowed to intrude in other people's territory so they can hear you about and things like that, which we get a couple of lamps. And so we have this design, which was very simply assessed. The assignment was to make black and white abstract of their individual understanding of the order of the campus based on those concepts that have been introduced in lecture. Of course, the campus is represented in the city. I had expected to get relatively objective city ground plans of the campus. What I got, and again, that's what the campus looked like. What I got were things that looked like this. The ones I'm going to show you here, a few, are highly selective, obviously. But let me just say, when I walked through the room with my expectations, I had initially no idea what I was looking at. And quickly figured out that the students knew better than I did what was being represented, and these things were all standing on a chalkboard in the room, 15 by 20 boards roughly. And I said to them, pick one, not yours, and stand up and go up there and explain it to us. And the longer you wait, the harder it's going to get. And they did it, and they did a great job. And it was a revelation to me, making me understand it. Importantly here, look at the extent to which they had no difficulty flipping back and forth between what's a field, what's background, in terms of black and white, in terms of what's black and white, and applying this general idea to these different renditions. And you can pretty well begin to understand the extent to which it's inclusive of what their experience of the primary spaces and objects are or not, and the levels, different levels of abstraction. The links in these two, in one case, very, very naturalistic form, and the other ones, these big black dots out there are highly abstracted. The one on the right, the sense of energy moving up towards those lakes. Always making sure I got the way the main administration of Gold Dome building is represented, where there's within it, there's the figure ground flip right there, because how do you actually represent it? At the same time, you're trying to represent it as a more rectilinear kind of building, defining that space, which is it's in front. In these two, look at what's going on the south quad here. The one on the left, look how open the north side of the south quad is relative to the south of the north quad, which at that time is probably more true than it is now. The one on the right, the fact that the spaces of the main quad and the south quad and the north quad, where all the spaces are represented the same way the buildings are, as a positive white rectangle. But the other thing is set up quad, all those diagonals, and again, this sort of sense of energy or movement in a direction up towards those lakes and the points of foundation of the campus itself. Or here on the right, where the students taking the sense of the energy and ingrained the spaces. When we talk about the city's having texture or grain and those aspects of directionality, we use those kind of terms and so on and so forth. And here they are doing that kind of thing. The one on the left, if you know where Bond Hall was, you recognize it. And a line that runs between Bond Hall across the main quad and over to the library. The students basically describing the most important aspect of their regular daily experiences on the campus. So moving into the more subjective or other levels of subjectivity in terms of their own understanding of the campus. this kind of flip back and forth that they're doing is basically sophisticated when you think about it. And it belongs to that kind of tradition that's represented by E.M. Escher in these kinds of things that he did, where he's exploring this figure phenomenon. You can intend to a figure, like you take the birds, and you can either see the black bird or you can see the white one, but you can't see them both at the same time. It's just an aspect of our visual makeup, the extent to which we, intend in that, which is one figure in that way. And then it's translation from top to bottom, translation from right to left, day to night. It's a mix. So these students only, 2 months in to their education, just being introduced to this stuff, they're doing these figure grounds. They're manipulating the same kind of figure ground stuff, field stuff, and understanding at a level that's up there with Escher. In this case, on the one on the left, the fields are obviously radiating out from what this person sees as the object that's set in the gold stone. The one on the right, the radial center shifts down to the point of intersection between the main quad and the south quad. I believe there's an important statue there. Possibly, maybe, I don't know. Do you know what it is, you students up there? Is there a specific statue at that point that you know? Nobody's talking.
There is a statue. I'm not sure exactly there.
Let me know.
Not the story, wasn't it?
It's similar ideas on where the center is. The one on the left, obviously the one on the left, moves over to where? It's flatter or grace, right? So in this case, the student is making the center their own, their dormitory, their place. Again, a kind of more subjective aspect, more individual aspect of the notion. One on the right takes this idea of the envelope and the energy and the sort of magnetic field. It's almost like throwing rocks into a pool where they're radiating pieces over a map of one another. Again, what the campus looked like in that period of time, and so on. Again, that project, 1976. So I go away, and I come back to visit the campus, 12 or 15 years later or so, and the world is still continuing off in the modernist direction. And I come back and I see this building. And I'm actually stunned that the campus has taken a turn in, this decided a direction. And then it's re-embraced the collegiate Gothic architecture of the campus. I just see that on the outside of the building, and then I walk in, and I see this ceiling. And even though in the vault, the Gothic vault in this space, I have to tell you, I'm not Catholic. I'm not a particularly believer. I've had religious education. You might refer to me as a serialist. I don't know. But when I walked into the space, I'm damn near frightened. Because it evokes the sense of the campus so powerfully. It was amazing to me that this could happen. That any place basically had come this far in terms of what we might begin to do. And of course, now this is for you a kind of everyday reality because the campus really embraced this. That they say it, they make it explicit in the campus management plan that the buildings will do this. And this is an extremely rare thing. And they also connect it, if we have time and you should go read it, it connects it to the values of the institution. and makes it a direct connection between the values of the institution and what this campus should represent, what the campus should look like. It's quite amazing. This is a brief of what those 7 tenets are. Catholic heritage, sacramental vision, campus' home and academy, stewardship of the natural environment as the product of God, that you have to take care of it, that stewardship. And then the specific things about the spaces of the campus and what they will do and what they will be. Actually, the campus you now know on the campus, which is part of your everyday reality, appreciated. It's extremely exceptional to have that kind of continuity. I was stunned when I was traveling by these attachments to the stadium. It's not only that they embrace the collegiate Gothic, but that they, as you know, all 3 have completely different programs in these buildings. If the idea that modern architecture somehow represented a program, this totally puts that, to rest. And clearly, it's not about that. It's not about the modern architecture zeitgeist. It's all about the genus loci. And it's an unbelievably extraordinary thing, a project. If you have not seen the presentation that Doug Mark makes on this, I strongly recommend that you take the time to look it up. You can find it in the alumni material. At the same time, it continues to recognize the primary access to the Westbury Library. Talking to Doug Morris, when I mentioned about the collegiate Gothic, he says that's not all. It also specifically references the look of the old stadium and the memorials city. And, quite amazing. So there you talk about the psychocultural field. Here it is, present on the campus. And not something to take lightly or to take for granted. It's exceptional. Okay, so we were able to go to the Rowe Studies program in 78, 79. It's still all about modern architecture, the program. Kind of hard to get people to have the kind of attentiveness to traditional architecture that's an everyday reality here and now. I thought to myself, well, if there's one building that students should actually really know, and to myself, I said, pick one. I mean, I'm running around, I'm having students run around, charge appeal studies course. We're going out there, we're looking at buildings, and we're drawing in our sketchbook. But it's a kind of one-time thing. And I'm just thinking, if there's one they're really, really going to know well, it really ought to be the Pantheon. Not only that, the studio's only a couple of blocks away. They're actually walking past it every day, most of it, because it was a really great piece of the place on the street that goes up to San Ignacio. And I told them right at the beginning of the semester that on the midterm exam, it's going to be a major question. It's going to count a lot of points. Make a plan section elevation for the Pantheon. About a third of the students did a very credible job. What most of you would do, probably pretty easily, pretty readily. The other 2/3 flew with it. I mean, they did just awful stuff. The porch was defined as the body of the rotunda. The rotunda was all sole. It didn't have any thickness to it. On the front, 4 columns. 4, not 8. That's a lot had. The number had 6. The pediment was really pointy. I mean, it was. I was just. I've been thinking about it ever since. I do have to tell you that over time, over a long period of time, I realized that, they had not studied the object of reality. They were quite sure, they hadn't studied it. What were they doing at that moment in the test? They were doing their best job to remember it as they saw it and thought they experienced it, and they were trying to build out something from that little bit of memory. Okay, and on the basis of that, you could see the logic if you really thought about it. I'll give you one. If you're in the porch, how many spaces are there? 3. Okay, and if you know that, how many columns do you put on the front? 4. Because you never put a column in the middle on axis, right? Maybe 2, maybe. Okay. So you can kind of begin to understand on the basis of fragmentary experience how they had blown this thing so badly. It took me a long time to figure out what's the sort of big lesson here. It's that there is a huge gap between your subjective experience, what you experience directly, and your collection of memories, and what the objective reality is. And then in architecture, we depend an awful lot on our memory of things. And so what we need to do is we need to close the gap between what that experience is and what the memory is, which is why we emphasize drawing this stuff so much. It's so important, and these are illustrations of exactly that. And I've got a couple of others. I was quite amazed by this. One of the other faculty, Marilyn, put from student drawings, put this together, and you can see how analytic this person was relative to this the church center, so including the ceiling, right? The figures of the ceiling. So drawings, both analytic and specific, and also a kind of expression, kind of more freehand kind of stuff that Jim, the watercolors that Jim was making. So both types, the one on the left, of course, is Paris. I can't imagine an patient. I can't imagine thinking so deliberately to be able to make a drawing that's so well written on, just like the one on the left hand side. This is a challenge for the students. Go to Rome, and you're running around, you're looking at all these cities, you're looking at all these buildings, and doing your best to sort of try to remember and put the extremes together, put the town together with the buildings. I had one fun recommendation to you, which I call fear, peace, and urbanism. So that is to go to one of these places and beer pizza, and you get your beer and it comes quick. And now you wait around for the pizza, which takes about 20 to 25 minutes. What do? First of all, you go to the place that either has paper placemats or that white paper, that white paper covering the butcher paper, I think they call it, covered. One of you immediately takes out your pen held friend, and you draw something. Okay, and typically I would start with these, look around for a line across church with maybe a baptistry sitting in front of it or whatever, a little bit of spaces in a couple of blocks, moving away from it, you find it. And then you turn the pen over to somebody else and you say, add stuff to it. And it's fun. And you get going doing these things. And so I got a couple of these. And I thought this was interesting. Somebody in the process of making this up in the upper left-hand corner wrote down, I can't do this. And somebody, better answer it. Yes, you can. And at first I thought it was one of the regular gang that's listed out there. And then I realized, it was Bianca Latini, Antonio Latini's daughter. I think she was probably 18 or 19. She hadn't studied architecture, and she was with us, and she felt intimidated by these people. But we insisted, that she draw too. And frankly, I don't know what she drew. She did just fine. So, jump in. Hey, jump in. The campus has multiple landscapes. The natural landscapes and both what I call isothermal landscapes. Both those traditions are here. This is another piece, I think, important for cities, for architecture, and putting together. And just like we do figure grounds, and just like we make buildings with roads and spaces, students can do this and they can learn it quickly. As you see with the rough design, I mean, this is I use these as models. This is one of the parks from the Bergen Plan for Chicago, and describe how both the classic and romantic sort of come together in this composite relationship. One is hierarchically more important than the other. It's the naturalistic, in this case, man's peripheral experiential, looking at nature's the primary, and so on and so forth, and doing projects again, using the campus as an model in the city. This was a project done at Colnell University. The shrine is the big building at the bottom right. A number of years I was teaching here. I was also teaching in the summertime in Catholic too, and this was a project that came out of that. That one year, this one was a similar project done at the University of Maryland, second one in D.C. The reason I have it in here is because the student also invented, as we asked him to do, invent the architecture, to be thinking about it in terms of what the hierarchy would be. It was essentially a sketch project to run through that series. So typically, begin with, as much as possible, begin with a natural landscape, then do exercise instead, having to learn about the organic and the classical, put them together, and then introduce buildings by doing first a campus, some of the landscape and then cityscape are more in balance. And then do it as a more dense city environment. I also did it with Michael Lakutis invited me to teach the graduate students in Rome. We did it with the Villa Borghese, same series of things. So within the class is the campus version, the one on the right. Is the city version. You can see a little bit of a connection. You can feel it not, they're not exactly direct. This, this course is an Notre Dame graduate student. The C.J. Allen was now teaching at Catholic in D.C. Right. Big recommendation here. The students pick something to be passionate about, to make it your thing, whether it's a building type, spatial type, a subject, visual phenomenon, make it yours. Close the gap between that subjective experience and that objective reality. Understand that there are numerous organizations out there that are devoted to this model of ideas. It's helpful to you to connect to them. You have skills that they can use. You can contribute. And you gain a lot back by being connected with that, group of people from whom you can continue to learn. Get out there and do it. you go out there with a high skill level, very exceptional, which I think you're beginning to understand or you already know. The society needs it. I mean, Stepanos was talking about this in the office earlier today. I met him, and I'm very impressed with the extent to which the school is being engaged with that work, trying to bring these lessons. Wherever you go, wherever you do, join that society, serve it, engage you, you'll benefit. It all adds up. It all adds up. We thank you. Thank you very much.
So, of course, in the editing process, I of course, should have mentioned that Steve and I went over every sentence, every line, at least 3 or 4 times. And maybe that's why the book took 10 years. Because I think it got twice as long, maybe twice as good, I'm not sure, twice as long as what we originally anticipated. It kept on growing. I was one of those people who Steve said, you really have 2 essays here. So I took a cue from my co-editor.
We ran them. Yes, sir.
You talked about a great deal, and we're very lucky to have you here and to hear this lecture from the 2 of you, and to have this book in the library and in our offices. One thing you didn't talk about today was what it was like to have Colin as a teacher and what the studios were like as you experienced his teaching.
Well, it turns out, if you don't mind my jumping in, it turns out that Jim and I had extremely different experiences undergraduate, and which colored how it turned out we thought about our graduate experience at Cornell. So in my case, I got a 6-year degree at Princeton, when Princeton was apparently at one of its worst possible pedagogical educational moments in its history. It sucked. I mean, can you hear it in my voice? I am still angry about how terrible that educational experience was. The reason I understand how terrible it was is because shortly thereafter, I went to Cornell into the graduate program. But not only did that expose me in the graduate program, it exposed me to what kind of pedagogical experience the 5-year students were having at Cornell. And it blew me away. I sat in on a number of these undergraduate courses that were being taught by this faculty. What was the difference? They were teaching. Which is not what happened, at Princeton in my experience. This came home to me at a moment where Jim and I had a debate about a sentence. And I basically wanted to say that architecture should start with the city, not the building. And Jim was okay with the first half of that sentence. He was okay with architecture should start with the city. He was not okay with continuing on saying not the building. Okay? I was really surprised. Really? And he said something very simple. It was not my experience. And then I had this reaction like this, boom, boom, one after the other, which was, what? He can't go past his experience, to something else? And then I thought, well, wait a second, what was the experience and what was mine? Well, his experience was he went through that 5-year architectural education at Cornell where he was being taught, right? And so when I went to Cornell, it was like this. It was like, being dumped in the deep end of the pool. sink or swim kind of deal and learning all this material as fast as I could. Whereas for him, it had been built up more slowly, more directly over time, and integrated with the experience that is not just about the building, but also about the city as he's going through the entire program all the way through Cornell. Experience matters.
So for me, when I studied at Cornell as an undergraduate, as Steve mentioned, and it was Colin's plan and his wish to always have a number of undergraduate students from the program in the urban design program that he taught. So he would cultivate undergraduates to enter his program. He didn't cultivate me. In fact, I started my graduate education in something called architectural science, kind of quasi engineering. And a friend of mine, Jack Lehmeyer, said, Jim, if we don't take a course with Colin Rowe, we'll always regret it. Like, seminar or reading class. And so I said, okay, Jack, let's do that. So we did. We talked to Colin. He was very amenable to this. And so we read, I still remember the first book we read. Camilo Cite was one of them, but another one was by Jacques Berzon, Darwin, Marx, and Wagner. So I did my homework and read the book very thoroughly, went to Colin's house, apartment with Jack, and I thought, gee, Colin's going to quiz me about chapter 3 and what did Berzon really mean? And Camilo Cite, what do you think how we fit into 19th century Viennese society? And so we went to Colin's house. He said, what would you like to drink? And then he said, why don't you make yourself at home in the library? So we did. He said, pick out one of those large folios devoted to furniture, late 18th century furniture, Empire furniture. So he was fixing drinks and I was looking at a furniture catalog. He said, well, what do you think of this? And I said, I don't know. What do I think about a bunch of funny looking pieces of furniture on the page? He said, what about that one? He came into the room. What about that one in the upper left-hand corner? I said, oh, it's okay. You're sort of wondering, it's the text, what's going on here? Turn over the page. Well, what do you think of this page? And by that time, I'm petrified that I'll choose some god-awful piece of furniture that will make me look like a complete fool to Colin. But after a while, you turn one page after another, there's something about a piece of furniture. Peterson tells the same story, that there's something about the way the leg curves and meets the ground plane that's really beautiful. Some Percier and Fontaine furniture. And we didn't talk about Jacques Berzon. We didn't talk about Camilo Cite. We talked about architectural form, furniture. It was only later on that I realized that Colin had he had two chaise lounges in his apartment in Ithaca. One was an Eames lounge, famous Eames lounge. The other one was an early 20th century ocean liner deck chair, the kind that had things that flipped in and out and the legs could expand. And, it's sort of this mechanical whiz as opposed to this modern lounge. And I still think to this day, the test was from Colin, which one would you sit in? Which one would you sit in? Would you sit in this mechanical device or this high modern lounge chair? So there were always these things going on with Colin. I mean, not in a mean-spirited way, but just him wanting to learn about you, introducing you to maybe new ways of seeing and understanding the world, beginning, for God's sake, with furniture, which I thought was completely kind of wacky and certainly unexpected. So by the end of the second week, I was hooked. And I asked to join the studio, which Colin let me in. I was very surprised, actually. The interview took place in the studio and lasted about 10 minutes. And he said, okay, you're in. And that reading, which began with those two books, morphed into kind of great books, lesson in architecture, but also in philosophy and politics. Do any of you know Vince Lombardi? In his book, the great football coach, he had us read a book about Vince Lombardi, and it was about a great coach and how the coach led his team to victory. Something there, oh, a great coach leading his team to victory. I get it. Right. So, there is such a wide range of material to read, to look at, think about, that it was a very immersive education. I think that really what was happening, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I think, Colin had taught at Cambridge for a couple of years, at least 2 years, I think, or 4 years. So there's the dawn tradition where you invite your student into your apartment or suite of rooms, and you talk about their thesis, their project, whatever's on their mind. And there's this conversation going on. And I think that Colin really gave us an incredible amount of time, personal time, in a kind of tutorial way, in a kind of dawnship way. That of course we had the studio, but there was also all this other stuff that was going on. So it was really a 24/7 kind of operation. You're working late at night in the studio, and Colin would be coming in with Fred Coder, and they'd both be wearing black turtleneck sweats. And they said, "Boy, you two look like you're really up to no good." I mean, there was that kind of rapport you can have with Colin, and always curious about what was going on in the studio at any time he might drop in. And so that was part of it. I mean, it was quite an experience. We didn't have a syllabus. We didn't have a reading list per se. There's one that appears in our book that Fred Coder put together, not Colin, but of course Colin consulted with Fred on that. Fred consulted with Colin on the reading list, and it appears in Antonio Latini's essay about the kind of intellectual roots of Colin Rowe and his thinking and what we were expected to read. But Colin didn't have a reading list. As I said, he didn't have a syllabus. I'm not sure if Colin could survive in 21st century university. I don't think he could, certainly not at the University of Oregon, the way the administrative apparatus is tending to beat us down. So I don't know. There are some random thoughts.
Sure, different teachers have different styles. Collins is, I think, truly unique in his ability to make, what Jim said, some kind of connection with the student. And he had this unbelievable memory that I can't even imagine, which allowed him to do these kind of things. I say this to students in general, using myself as an example, but don't ever be afraid to ask a stupid question or one that you think is stupid. I mean, I just read one of his essays or something. There was a line in there that said something about something like Judeo-Christian millennialism. I had no idea what that was. And I was, naive enough or whatever to just blurt out and ask Colin, what is Christian Judeo millennialism? And his answer was to suggest that I read 4 books, which I did. You say no reading list, but here's this guy walking around with this unbelievable reading list in his head. So that if you asked him a question like that, he would potentially recommend a certain set of books. That's partially the origin, I think, of the reading list that Fred put together, because what happened was over time, students are sharing the knowledge. Well, Colin said to read this. Somebody would say, Colin said to read this. go read The Theory of the Avant-Garde by so-and-so, go read Scientific Revolution by Hayek, go read, and we started writing these things down. And for those who were so inclined, then you began reading more and more and more of these books. And so I think at some point, that's what happened, was that Fred kind of collected that material at that moment in time, put it together to read, which seemed to not have a long life. We were talking about it being an odd thing, and later in the book, the teeny treats it as though it lasted forever, but it didn't. I mean, we talked to various people who said they never saw it.
I think I have a quick question, follow-up question. First of all, thank you so much for the interesting talk. And this is also really piggyback to the question Stefan had. It is obvious that Colin Rowe have left huge impact on his students, including all of you, right? And also, it is very obvious his contribution to the urban design theory. That is very clear. So my question is, before this talk, I have heard a lot of story about Colin Rowe when I was at Maryland. He, as you mentioned, he spent tremendous time with students and constantly teaching. And so my question for you is, do both of you have any suggestion for all of us who are teaching right now in the kind of a different academic environment, in general, and how we can continue to teach and how we can try to make the positive impact on our students in general?
It's really tough. It's a really tough thing because of all the requirements that are placed on us today, that somewhat constrain interaction.
I will say, I'm sorry. Colin believed that the studio was the most important vehicle for teaching architecture by far. That's where everything came together. So it's not that lectures and seminars and reading or whatever was not important, but he really did believe in the messiness of the studio context and learning, not only learning from Colin, but learning from the students, and where you'd actually have to make stuff, you'd have to come up with some resolution in a finite period of time that was a response to some kind of problem. And I think Colin, he was much more at home, I think, in the end, much more at home in the studio than in the lecture room and even in the library. For him, I believe that he really loved the studio, and that was where he had the most fun, the most engagement. And that then makes me think about the kind of studio products that you might give. And in all the time that I was in Rowe's studio, and I think subsequent to this, he never gave a utopian project, design a city in the middle of the forest or in the plains, or a lunar landing kind of Mars. Everything was grounded somehow in some kind of practical, pragmatic condition that was a sponsor to something that could transcend it and be more interesting and get beyond to something maybe far deeper. So whether it's Buffalo or Roman Perota or other projects that were done in the class, they always had that core. They always had that core. Robert Maxwell said something in one of his essays about Colin. He said something about it being a triumph of common sense, his work. And I think there's a lot of truth to that Colin I remember a story about Colin being on a review. I think it was at Harvard. I was not there, but I only heard about this. And a student wanting to impress the great man, the student of hotel, started talking about transparencies and about continuities with intersectional and whatever's. And Colin said, "Oh, you have a hotel. Where's your porte cochere?" And the student sort of looked at him. Said, "Well, you ride by a taxi or a car. You got to get into the hotel without being rained upon. Where's your porte cochere?" So there's this multidimensional aspect to it. Personally, and I'm not sure if Colin would agree with this or not, but personally, I think Colin would. He would like to give problems that already had some stimulus. It was anathema to him to just give an open site. Much better to give a site where there's some provocation. It could be a bad provocation. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a good one, but something that needed fixing, or something incomplete, something that would require you to think about how you would respond to it. And that I think was very important. It was always, basically, it boiled down to a site that was an interesting and challenging site. The program for Colin was frankly not very important, at least while I was there. He did distinguish between monumental or civic buildings and texture buildings, but whether that monumental or civic building was a library or a courthouse or museum was probably less important than it be identified as a civic building, as opposed to background buildings or texture buildings. Typically would be housing or commercial, but not always. So the site was a very important ingredient, and I think that challenge in the studio was always essential for him. I hope that answers your question a little bit. It's getting late. You may have worn out our welcome.
If not,
We all think too long.
Sorry.
We all think too long.
I don't know how much of a question this is, but you talk about experience. And I just ran across the book title when I ordered it. It's called Extinction of Experience, where anywhere in the world today, people are having the same experience, the same Starbucks, the same McDonald's, the same Kentucky Fried Chicken. Whether you're in Beijing, whether you're in South Bend or New York, or Paris, or wherever. And Colin's fluidity, intellectual fluidity, and everything that was at that era at Cornell also presupposed a common experience, whether you were from China, India, New York, Alabama. It may have been the common experience of the human city, wherever it was. And today that experience is largely extinct. I mean, we see fragments of it. We send our students to Rome, and they see it. They see the forms. There's still the pizzeria, there's still the wine bar, there's still the wonder of life is still present in a lot of places, but it's rapidly being diminished, and partly through you commented about the university experience and what's happening to universities today. So I don't know the question of asking, but I guess it's an observation that there is this loss of experience, a loss of wonder about the human city and the humane city. And I don't know where we go from here. I mean, that's the question. We're kind of picking up on what Ming just said.
Well, just to add on to one aspect of the studio, and that is for Colin, whether you were from Alabama or from Kuala Lumpur, he knew more about those places than the students. He could tell you the history of a small town in upstate New York much better than someone from Skaneateles or from Mumbai. He was amazing that way, and he relished that. He did not try to erase that experience. He tried to draw out that experience, and actually it was good for the entire class to draw out that experience. He was delighted. I mean, that's why so many of the theses appeared in hometowns, from students' hometowns. So he really wanted to develop, I don't know, I think somehow develop part of you, part of you that maybe you hadn't explored yourself to bring that out. And it's true, Michael, if the environments that we're living in now don't have that quality, it really diminishes the possibilities, the potential of richness of a studio experience like the one that Colin taught.
But this question is getting a bit late. The back cover of your book, there's 25 names in the back cover.
Yes.
How many people do you think that Colin taught at Cornell? And what does 25 represent out of that whole number? There's 25 colleagues are very distinguished in their own way as intellectuals first and foremost, as academics, and as professionals. And what do you think ultimately Colin's influence was based on what his students achieved and his students? And that actually is a comment that is, that's a long question to answer. The second part I'm going to say, but our students at Maryland, at Oregon, or at Notre Dame, in a position where 30 years from now, there will be 25 of them to be able to write, teach, and practice that way, with consequence, with the base of ideas, and with the possibility of being transformative players in every way. I mean, are we going in the direction, despite the existence of places that continue to teach consequentially, we're losing our world just in front of us, because we can't be ourselves sure that we're teaching the right vector in the right direction. You don't have to answer the question.
By the way, just to answer the easy part of it, Blake Middleton did do an accounting of all the people who graduated from the program, which is in his, I guess I'm turned off, which is in his essay about his influence. I think there are 180 graduates during the period from all over the world. But there's also a global map that shows where people are coming from. But that's the easy part to answer your question.
All the ones that we used to have a thesis in the library. So someone through the program and didn't submit, a thesis. So there's more that went through the program that are actually represented on that list of, close to a couple hundred. If that partially answers the question. And then, but how many of those taught? I mean, there is in Kerrigan's book, and which came out, I think, in 1996, if I remember right, Texas Rangers. He's got that chart in there where he tracks a whole bunch of different people having to do with not just Colin, but Texas Rangers and what the impact was in different schools. So there's some evidence, some trace of that kind of thing. I feel like the challenge is that lots of time there's only one. In any given school, so you show up and you have these ideas and so on and so forth, but the rest of the faculty don't share it. I was lucky when I hit Maryland as dean, partially because already there were 3 people who had gone through Colin's program. One was Tom Schumacher, who was one semester at me. The other 2 were Matt Bell and Brian Kelly. In addition to them, Colin had some influence anyway on the what happened in New York City under Mayor Lindsay, when they had all those urban design things, and some of the students from Cornell went and participated. in those events. And one of the guys teaching in Maryland, this guy Carl Dupuy, had worked in one of those offices for like 8 years. I mean, he was as urban as you could get, in terms of teaching this material. That made what, 5 of us, out of the faculty, maybe 15, are really devoted to these ideas. Even then, it was still hard, to get it across to the students, partially because there was still sort of a dominance of modernist language. People had very difficult time taking that, that last step. I remember having this conversation with one of the guys, Bill Beckhofer, had been in Peace Corps, he'd done stuff in Afghanistan, Middle East, etc. He loved taking students over there, so he would do field trips over there all the time. And he would show me these projects, and the projects, had to do with the texture of those places, those cities, and stuff like that. What they didn't have was they didn't have those details. One time I challenged him about that. I said, that stuff's really great, but the detail, none of the detailed stuff, which is part of that language of the architecture, is there. Why is that? He said, I guess I'm a modernist after all. So it's a tricky thing.
So let me just say a quick word about the University of Oregon. There's always a strong Oregon Cornell connection with people like Roger Sherwood and Fred Coder, Mike Dennis, and Colin noted that he knew a lot of people from Oregon, including Sherwood and Dennis and Coder, but people like Terry Williams, Norman Crow, who of course taught here for a number of years. At one time, Alvin Boyarsky, Lee Hodgson, a whole bunch of people taught at Oregon, and I was pleased to be able to host, not me personally, but the University of Oregon hosted Colin as its inaugural Beluski Fellow in 1995, and he wrote this letter of acceptance for this offer, saying about all the people that he knew at Oregon and how he considered them to be an extended family, and you could have a convocation with people from the University of Oregon. And at some point he said, it's a place of outstanding brilliance. And when I saw Colin, I said, you've never been to one of our faculty meetings. I thought you wouldn't say that. But there was this network. Alvin Boyarsky was at the AA. I'm not quite sure you can see Colin Rowe through the work of the AA, maybe just the reverse in some ways. But Alvin was a good friend of Colin, was operating in that scene, and people from there was an Italian connection as well. So there was this certainly at the ETH in Switzerland, and I know that at the University of Puerto Rico, there was it's clearly a network, an important network that he was the center of. What's next? I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question, Stefan. I'm still thinking about it.
Steph, I mean, and anybody out there who's doing any practicing knows the magnitude of the challenge. In terms of sort of suburban development, stuff, and the mythical aspect of that. That an awful lot of it's dictated by combination of property rights and zoning codes. And the pretense is that that's not true, that it's the marketplace. But the people who are doing it, they know what the reality of that situation is. And it's kind of hard to fight that. And I was really discouraged when I saw, remember Roger Rowe, he ran for president, this big wealthy guy. I saw randomly, I ran into this thing, somebody was interviewing Ross Perot, and they asked him how he would advise his kids. And he basically said that they're making a lot of money in real estate development, and they're buying land outside of where it is. Houston, they're buying all these big pieces of land out there, you know, because the place you're going to make money is building more suburbs. You know, it's like the magnitude of the problem, you know, is gigantic, and challenging some fundamental aspects of it at every level is really important. And yet when people begin to understand, you know this, when people begin to understand better what they want, they begin to understand based on what you can do to help them visualize it. As that becomes clear to them, then the citizens can fight back. They can find the tools. So it's converting that. Really, it's about converting that having to do with the values that they want. I mean, what's the great success of the CNU? Is that those kind of developments, the development community understood that there was a thirst for community, and that those kind of developments facilitate, provide the opportunity for a community that the standard suburb, you know, doesn't. It struck me the other day, I'm reading essays in the Washington Post worrying about, you know, young people looking at their phones, you know, and this other aspect of things. And I started thinking about life in the suburbs, how individualistic it is, how detached it is from any notion of community. And nobody ever relates to the fact that we're instinctively social animals. Okay, we're a social animal in an isolated world. You know, and so what are they doing? You know, I go visit somebody's house out there in the suburbs, TV's on all the goddamn time. You know, and they're looking at their cell phone, right? They're trying to attach to the community the only way they can because they don't have it outside the door, right? And CNU, basically what you're doing is you're making community right outside the door. And so it's closer, much closer to being the city. You know, it's at a village level, right? So.